Hi everyone, Patricia Worby Alchemy Therapies here. And today I want to do a little talk on cancer, believe it or not. This is a subject that a lot of people find very frightening, and obviously because of the suffering involved, there's a lot of taboo around discussion of this subject. But I wanted to introduce it from a very different angle, an angle of hope and something you can do. This idea of cancer as being an inevitable, bad luck, or possibly genetic cause needs to be updated. Like many diseases that we're currently suffering, many chronic diseases anyway, there is a new understanding coming into the realm of science now, and that is that cancer may be more of a metabolic disease, just like diabetes and Alzheimer's, which we're now realizing. So this model that we've learned, what is termed the somatic mutation theory, in other words, that something goes wrong in the cell and it starts to behave like a single organism, multiplying randomly due to genetic damage in the nuclear DNA, needs to be rethought, because it doesn't really explain, with a tightly controlled cellular environment, what would initiate. And I was taught that it was sort of a random accumulation of genetic damage. But then why childhood cancers, where repair mechanisms are much better? You can't really explain it from that model. Why do some cancers go into remission and others don't? What about spontaneous remission, which is known about? Many doctors have known people who've spontaneously recovered, but it's just hardly researched because it doesn't make money for the pharmaceutical industry, who make billions from licensing and selling chemotherapy drugs, which are highly toxic and have a huge degree of suffering involved in the treatment. I mean, chemo could really be said to be one of the few treatments that are almost worse than the disease. And I know this from personal experience. I've not had cancer myself. Well, I have actually. I've had skin cancer, but I've had it in my family, and I've watched someone go through chemotherapy. So I'm not just talking from theory here. So what other alternative explanations are there? Well, there are alternative explanations that do explain things like the cancer paradox, the idea that the cells would just keep replicating and starting to use glucose preferentially. That's another feature of cancer that we know about, because, in fact, we measure glucose uptake to determine whether a tumor is present or not. So the cells not only start multiplying exponentially, but they also start to gobble up all the available glucose. And by the time they've done that, you start to lose weight, and very rapidly, and that's cachexia, which you will have observed if you've seen anybody having cancer. So weight loss, sudden weight loss, is another major feature. So it makes no sense, as we have observed with some people who've gone through cancer treatment, to be told to bulk up afterwards on glucose drinks, foods like buns and cakes and biscuits, and these are the worst foods, in fact, for you to recover from, because they simply re-stimulate the same mechanisms of glycolysis, glucose breakdown. And what you actually need are foods that encourage fat use as a major source of energy, so a ketogenic diet, which you will have heard of in the news, but probably not so much in terms of cancer. So I've written a book called Losing Our Minds, Cellular Basis of Health and Aging, and I've got a chapter in here all about cancer, so some of this information is coming from that book. But I wanted to sort of give you a quick summary then. So alternatives to this random genetic lottery. Well, Otto Warburg was a scientist who looked at he looked at many aspects of biochemistry, and in fact he won 2 Nobel Prizes, so that's quite a rare thing for his work. And he looked at more of the energy requirements of the cell and how it might be energy metabolism that switches the cell into this cancerous growth pattern. And in particular, it may not be the nuclear DNA, the double helix coiled chromosomes that you'll have seen that exist within the nucleus of the cell, which we used to regard as the brains of the cell, and we now know probably isn't. It's just the blueprint. It's been noted that if you transfer the nucleus from a cancerous cell into a healthy cell, the healthy cell does not develop cancer. But if you transfer the cell cytoplasm, the fluid that surrounds the nucleus, into a healthy cell, then it does develop cancer. So it's clearly something in the cell fluid. And there are various theories as to what that could be. It could be the pH changes in the cell, although I know that's very controversial. But more likely, I feel, as we're now discovering the importance of mitochondria, which are your energy factories that sit bathed in this cell fluid. And there are many, many mitochondria in a cell, I mean thousands. And they are more than just energy producing organelles. They actually signal to each other. They signal to each other within that cell, and they, by means of their metabolites, the things they produce, they also signal to other cells in the organism, and in particular to the cells of your gut. Your gut, as you may now know, is not just a sterile tube. It contains many thousands of organisms called microbes. Some of these are bacteria, some are fungi, some are viruses, and some are really tiny organisms that we don't even know yet. But there are billions of these, and mitochondria communicate with them because mitochondria were once bacteria themselves. So what seems to have happened over evolution or design, there's a controversy over whether you believe in evolution or not. Obviously, I'm a scientist, so evolution makes sense to me. But let's say that over evolution, what seems to have happened to make us as we are now is that certain bacteria combined with a very, very primitive cell, an animal cell, probably floating in the early seas, and that switched its metabolism from being very slow and ponderous to being quite efficient, because one thing bacteria do very well is produce energy, which is why they can grow so fast. So once a bacterium had fused with an animal cell and over evolutionary time become absorbed in as normal part of that cell, it gifted us animals the ability to produce energy, and hence everything we do is about energy, and particularly our brains as human beings, which use a vast amount of energy. We need that exponential sort of boost or energetic input in order to be who we are. So we have this mitochondrial influence, and mitochondria are very interesting organelles. They have their own DNA, that's the other thing, but the DNA is not in a double helix like the DNA you've seen in picture books. It's actually a coil, like a ring structure. It's still twisted, but it's coiled, so it's like a donut. And these DNA strands are actually they don't divide and they don't mingle and mix. So you've seen how a chromosome in the nucleus, normally you get one half from the male side and one half from the female side, and they fuse, and obviously then we get genetic variation. Well, mitochondrial DNA, being a former bacterium, doesn't have that. It just has simple replication, and it comes from the maternal line, and that's something really important. So it just comes from your mother, who got it from her mother, from her mother, and her mother, and her mother, and so on. So imagine this is a very different message to the nuclear DNA. It can change very quickly. It can be very damaged very quickly because it's not protected by the nuclear membrane. It's just floating in these little mitochondria in the cell membrane. So if we have an external assault, something like toxins, or something like stress, which produces stress of the mother, for instance, can induce stress in the child. And stress hormones are very damaging. They're not benign at all. It could be radiation. It could be toxic food. There are many assaults that can happen to the body and cause the mitochondrial DNA to start replicating uncontrollably and with many mutations. And this, we think, could be the basis of cancer proliferation. And so it's a very different understanding with a very different solution. Because if you just kill all the cells that are dividing rapidly, which is what chemotherapy does, and that's why your hair falls out and your gut is totally destroyed, because your gut cells are turning over very, very fast in the body, every 3 days actually, then we need a new therapy that doesn't just look at killing all the rogue cells, but looks at what the cell environment might be that is producing this uncontrolled proliferation. And that'll be the subject of my next talk, what you can actually do to change the cell environment or milieu. We sometimes refer to it as a milieu. It's an understanding that it is the environment that changes the DNA and not the other way around. And this is an epigenetic understanding, and it's fairly new in science. When I was training 30 years ago, it was unheard of. We just assumed the DNA produced the proteins which changed the cell. We now know that the environment switches on and off the genes or the blueprint, which adapts to the environment. So it's really about the environment, what you do, what you think, what you eat, the exercise you do or don't do, what you drink, the relationships you have, the stress you're under. These all constitute an internal message of threat or safety. And this, we think, is at the basis of why mitochondria, which pick up that message, might decide to go rogue and produce uncontrolled growth. So that's food for thought, isn't it? I'll be talking about it more in my next video. But for now, check me out on alchemytherapies.co.uk and this book, Losing Our Minds, which is on Amazon, paperback and Kindle. Okay, great to talk with you. Leave any comments as usual. Thanks very much. Bye for now.